It's been fascinating to read the reactions different people have had to this book. Kirkus, notoriously among the toughest reviewers, gave the book a starred review, and Kirkus states that it assigns stars to books that the editors deem to be of remarkable merit. Kirkus called the third miracle an intriguing intriguing glimpse into the Vatican saint-making process as well as entertaining. Kirkus also said, the author presents an epic story that opens up over 150 years of church history, shining the spotlight on diligent women of faith who otherwise we would never know. Now, these same women of faith, the Sisters of Providence, issued a statement about my book, quote, "We are disappointed that Mr. Briggs seems to infer that sainthood is for sale." And I never really inferred that sainthood was for sale. All I said was it costs $1 million to obtain it. So it could be splitting hairs, but that's true. As they say in the book business, embrace controversy, and I gladly do that. How did I discover this topic? The mortal sin of every writer on the planet, and one of my former editors will acknowledge this, procrastination. It was June 14, 2007, a Thursday. I was working on my first book, Amped, and just needed a little break and began trolling the internet to see what was going on in the world. I pulled up a website of one of our local newspapers, and one headline absolutely grabbed me immediately, stole my attention, and I'll read it. Vatican sizes up girl's cure. Family believes prayers to priest delivered miracle. Now, I copied a few passages from that story. This is what really pulled me in. I had to find out more. I was raised in the Catholic faith, but I was not familiar with this process. The story begins, the question of whether a Denver girl was cured by a miracle, courtesy of an 18th century missionary priest, is now in the hands of the Vatican. The Denver Archdiocese has wrapped up its part of an investigation into whether Father Junipero Serra intervened to save Kayla Rebecca Kellogg from severe birth defects before she was born. A local team spent 7 months collecting documents, including independent medical data, which is now at the Holy See for further evaluation. It's all part of an investigation into whether the California priest is worthy of sainthood. Members of the Archdiocese team interviewed under oath the original obstetrical team and also assembled an independent medical panel to assess the case. The probe was finished in April. An 18th century missionary, medical data, doctors and priests in the same room, a possible miracle. I was hooked. I did some more reading and made some phone calls to ecclesiastical experts and some theologians. I learned that this was an ancient and exhaustive process, underline exhaustive. The church conducts secret tribunals to vet the facts, question witnesses, and dissect medical evidence related to the cures. The vast majority of these cases, of these claimed miracles, are ultimately vetoed by the church. And I found out that in the Catholic Church, miracles are the currency of sainthood. That people who live virtuous lives can be considered for sainthood 5 years after they die. But they need a special pass to get into that elite club. And the newspaper story added, in canonization cases, the miracle must be scientifically verifiable physical or biological cure that's completely unexplained by natural means. Then it's up to the Pope to decide whether the person should be canonized. I learned there were 4 cornerstones, 4 things that the Vatican needed to see to authorize, to stamp an unexplained cure as a miracle. And those 4 things are, it has to be definitive, it has to be instantaneous, perfect, and most of all, it has to defy, in their view, all scientific law. For a person to reach Catholic sainthood, the church must verify that 2 living people prayed to the saintly candidate in times of urgent crisis, usually a medical emergency. The Vatican must ultimately agree that those prayers to the would-be saint, prayers asking for what the church calls intercession, or help in a crisis, must have prompted the unexplained healing, in their view, cause and effect. These are the Catholic Church's basic saint-naming rules, its canon laws. And I saw an opportunity to apply some journalism to these miracle investigations, and I thought, this might be my next book. Faith versus reason, religion versus science. This is good stuff. Now I needed the best possible narrative on which to place some of these themes. I initially called the Archdiocese of Denver, where I live, but I was told that because the case was then under review at the Vatican, they could not speak about it. The Vatican frowns on diocese officials speaking publicly about active cases. And this is one of the reasons why so few people are aware of this process. So I began exploring and looking for my narrative. I explored miracle investigations in sainthood causes in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, New York, and in Hawaii. And as I always say, I was really rooting for the one in Hawaii. 6 months in Hawaii, I think I could have some fun with that. Then I looked at a miracle investigation that had already been completed, and because that had been finished, that had one big advantage. The Archdiocese leaders there, this is in Indianapolis, could talk to me about the ecclesiastical process and about the trial that they had held to examine the miracle. I learned that the healing they scrutinized involved a convent caretaker named Phil McCord. Phil took a job as the head of maintenance at the convent called St. Mary of the Woods in the late 1990s. And oddly enough, this is just as the sisters had begun a global search to find the second miracle necessary to elevate their foundress, Mother Theodore Guerin, to sainthood. In 1997, they celebrated Vatican approval of the first miracle attributed to Mother Theodore, the spontaneous healing in 1908 of a sister with terminal cancer. That case took 89 years to pass muster in Rome. Similarly, the cause to sanctify Mother Theodore had been underway for almost 100 years. The Woods, as the sisters called it, was a miracle-hungry place when Phil McCord stepped onto campus. Not long after he got there, he required cataract removal. This was routine outpatient surgery, but complications set in. His right eye, which was blind after the procedure, became an angry shade of red, and the right side of his face sagged for months as if he'd undergone a stroke. Facing a cornea transplant to restore full sight, Phil stepped into a convent chapel in January 2001. He was terrified about his limbing procedure, and as he told me, he was just done with people sticking needles in his eye. This is a man who can fix anything and is very proud of that fact, and yet he was contemplating not fixing the biggest problem he had ever faced. So he steps into the chapel, he follows a stream of music, a stream of organ music, and it was the organist warming up her fingers for the 11:30 a.m. Mass. Something about that music drew him in, the peacefulness, the tranquility, and he thought, I just will go in there and I'll sit and I'll think this through for a second. In the church, he did something he rarely does. He prayed. He asked Mother Theodore and God simply for strength to go through with the cornea transplant, just some confidence. He wasn't even sure how to pray. But when he awoke the next day, the first thing he noticed was his eye was dramatically better. And this is something that doctors dubbed impossible without surgery. His cell structure had reached a point where his eye could not spontaneously heal on its own. His vision, horrible since childhood, even returned to 2020. This is without any medical intervention. When the nuns at the Woods suggested that Phil's healing might be a miracle, he wasn't sure he believed them. He was a man of science, an engineer, and he believed in the laws of nature. He openly acknowledged that he truly wrestled with the concept that God had picked to heal him. When I read about that tension, I thought I might have my narrative. When I called Phil McCord in 2007, I knew 5 minutes into that interview that he was the story. This was my guy. He was humble and soft-spoken. He was thoughtful and smart. He had been raised in the Baptist faith, but he wasn't particularly devout. And instead of being thrilled by his new eyesight, he was somewhat haunted by the concept that perhaps he had received a supernatural healing, or so he had been told. He asked over and over, why me? Did I really deserve God's help? And that introspective humility, that tension, that quest to answer those impossible questions drew me to this story. And this is why I began my book with this prologue. I felt it immediately places you, the reader, in touch with that deep unease and these profound doubts that Phil carried for years. The convent's caretaker was an ordinary man, quiet and industrious, good with his hands, good with people. And while he rarely spoke of himself, if pressed, the caretaker would say he was diligent, clever, and careful about protecting precious things, such as his family and his planet. He wasn't Catholic. Of course, that never stopped the nuns from liking Phil McCord. He always fixed what was broken. In his 50-plus years, the caretaker had pondered and solved many conundrums, like snarled plumbing and leaky roofs, like who he was and why he was here. But after his baffling overnight cure, McCord faced new questions, and some of those questions bothered him deeply. Had he really deserved God's help? Would he ever receive a divine bill for his favor? And if that bill came due, how much would it cost him? The caretaker was shaped by an endless appetite to see and to grasp the intricate machinery of this world and beyond. He peered past the obvious surface, past accepted explanations. He ripped apart riddles, busted them down to better comprehend their complexities. How did electricity work? How did a biomass furnace function? How much of our paths were forged by self-determination and how much by a higher power? By McCord's estimation, people generally made their own choices in their own way in this life, and rarely, very rarely, did God step in. He compared his own vision of faith to the massive web of National Security Agency supercomputers that simultaneously eavesdropped on millions of email chats and phone conversations. They listen to everything, he said, and occasionally they pick up one snippet of something. I look at it like that. God doesn't micromanage, but when something pops up, when there's an opportunity to do something with meaning, there will be an intervention. This was one of the lessons he had learned after he beat the incalculable odds and suddenly got better. In blue jeans and a gray beard, the caretaker mirrored his homey, humble surroundings. Indiana was his land, and the place had branded him with certain essential values. Earn your keep, mend your own problems, and hash out your big decisions at the supper table. That was where he spent the better part of each evening, sitting across from his wife. She once had been a farm girl, now she was a nurse. A touch sarcastic, she had seen a lot of blood and a lot of death. She kept him grounded. I wonder what all this means, he posed one night as they shared another evening meal at the circular wooden table nestled just off their kitchen. She usually just listened quietly for a while, letting him vent, letting him search. Was I just at the right place at the right time? Am I worthy? How did this happen? How did that work? What caused it? It wasn't like there was a bolt of lightning or something. I don't understand. I've seen a lot of it. I've seen people walk away from so much worse, she finally answered. It is what it is. Deal with it. It happens. In fact, I've seen a lot of it. Accept it. If only I could, he thought. If only it was that easy. Looking back at his trial in 2003, he had done just as the priest had asked. He had told the truth. Yet long after he watched the priest smile at his miraculous tale, the caretaker fought to find some context in which he could understand those facts, some universe in which that truth made sense. Before his swift recovery, he had been so frightened, so anxious and desperate. At least now he was healthy. He had found new vision. But he had not yet found peace. He still could not answer his own immense questions. He still had not cracked the most perplexing mystery of all. And with that, I'll thank you, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions about my reporting, my writing, what the sisters feel about me these days. Some of them love me, some of them don't. So please, anybody? The status of the case, I'm going to be a bit careful because I don't want to give away too much of the narrative, but the case was analyzed by, it went from Indianapolis to Rome, where a group of doctors that the Vatican hires, about 100 Roman doctors, they break down into small groups. This particular small group analyzed it. they found it to be, in their view, scientifically unexplainable. They're not asked, these doctors are not asked to say the word miracle. They're only asked to say, is it explainable or not? It then moved on to a group of theologians who needed to see, was there this cause and effect? Was there a prayer that he said to the foundress? And from there, and from their deliberations, it goes to the entire body of cardinals across the globe and to the Pope. It lands on the Pope's desk, and the Pope approved the miracle. And Mother Theodore became the 8th American saint, the most recent person sainted from this country. It was instituted 1,000, 1,200 years ago. I mean, essentially what you're saying, and she's asking, have miracles always been a part of the equation? What's always been there is the necessity that they are found to have lived a virtuous life, and their lives are combed through, and that's getting more complex, as you can imagine, especially with someone like John Paul II, who's written so prolifically. They have to go back and look at every word, every letter he's written, and I get into that in the book. A suitcase of letters they found between John Paul and a woman that raised some eyebrows in Rome. But essentially, I believe it was in the 1200s, they instituted the concept of 4 miracles were required, 4 proven miracles. John Paul, interestingly enough, in 1983, halved that number to 2. And the reason he did that was, and he began sainting record numbers of people, and the reason he did that was he used the miracle process, or the miracle investigation process and the sainting process, as an evangelical tool to sell the church to new markets. He was a marketing master, and he realized that this was going to bring people into the church, draw them into these stories, and the crowds who descend on St. Peter's Square sometimes are in the millions. So it is in addition to being a very inspirational process, it's also a money-making and marketing process. She asked who bears the cost of these causes. It is the diocese, the folks in the diocese that when the plate is passed on Sunday, they're asked to donate in memory of this saintly candidate. These causes can go on for centuries, or nearly a century. So the money that's collected is then doled out to, large amount of it is doled out to the miracle investigators who are brought in from Rome, and all their expenses are paid. They live fairly comfortably while they're traveling and back in Rome. It's where a lot of the money is spent. It's spent on bringing in medical experts and doctors, and ultimately, at the end of the day, the Pope gets a cut. They bring him, in the 2 ceremonies that I cover in the book, they bring him not only a check, but also what are known as relics, or pieces of that saint. And so the Pope is presented with a check and maybe 3 finger bones. And that's a long-standing tradition in the church, to present the Pope with these relics, which is an interesting side story as to why the relics are important, and the belief in relics and what they represent, if they hold any power. Well, she asked me how the book affected my own faith, and of course it did. You can't help but spend 2 years on a project looking at something scientifically and journalistically. I'm a little circumspect on answering that question because I'm a journalist, and I wrote this with the idea that truly I wanted people of faith to read this book and feel reaffirmed in what they believe. And I wanted people who were a little more cynical to look at it and come away with a reaffirmation that, this is a business, and this is, at the end of the day, a very modern marketing machine. So I will say, on a one-on-one basis, I'm more than happy to have that conversation. It's sort of, not that I compare myself to this man, but one of my heroes is Tim Russert. It would sort of be like hearing who Tim Russert voted for. But I do carry a relic in my pocket, and I have used it. Mm-hmm. A third-class relic, which is, very briefly, first-class relic is an actual piece of the saint, a bone, a lock of hair. A second-class relic, this is in the Catholic faith, second-class relic is an item that they used in their life, a bowl, a book, a spoon. A third-class relic is typically a piece of linen or any sort of cloth that's been laid against a first-class relic. So the magic sort of wears down as you go. But I have a third-class relic in my pocket and carry it with me. You can read into that however how much you want to. Yes, please. Yes, she was asking if this is a true story. It's absolutely down to the last letter, factually accurate. It's based on interviews I did with every single person who was involved in the primary narrative of the book, the investigation into the man, the cure of the man with the blindness in his right eye. I interviewed every doctor who looked at him. I interviewed the people who held the courtroom tribunal. I interviewed everybody in his family. And then for the sort of historic parts, those are all researched. And at the end of the book, you'll see, 45 to 50 pages of endnotes that document every fact in the book. So, yeah, it is 100% true. And just as a writer myself, and I've been a journalist for 25 plus years, I am just purely drawn to the art of telling a nonfiction tale, but telling it like a novel. So in other words, trying to use those facts in a way that bring the reader to, through the book. So as Phil even pointed out, and I was kind of in a cold sweat waiting for Phil to read it and then email me and let me know what he thought. And he said, I asked my family, was I really like this? Was this really the way, it happened? Because he was in the whirlwind, as he calls it, in the middle of it. And he said his son told him, oh yeah, he nailed you. And she was saying, you can't explain a miracle. And that is the sort of confounding aspect that when you're a scientist and you're looking to explain a miracle, basically what you're looking to do is say that you can't explain it. There is no explanation. So you're looking for a lack of science, essentially, which is, it's an odd way of going about proving something. You're proving that you can't prove it. Mm-hmm. He's asking about John Paul II's cause and the convenient timing and also the marketing aspects of that compared to the woman who is sort of one of the central characters in my book, an 18th century French immigrant, or 19th century French immigrant. I think that John Paul II, and I just actually wrote a piece for Huffington Post today on this, I think it's fair to ask about the speed with which they are pushing his cause. There have been two cases in the history of the church in which they waived the 5-year rule, which, by the way, used to be a 50-year waiting period. Now you must wait 5 years for the person after their death to launch their sainthood cause. For John Paul, it was a month, 6 weeks, I think. And so I just raised the question, how much of that is to balance the bad press that they have been receiving in Rome? Because this is going to, at least for a week or 2 weeks, be an enormous celebration. It's also interesting that the amount of money that's spent on a cause doesn't seem to matter if you're talking about Pope John Paul II or a nun that only the folks in Indiana are familiar with. It's still about the same amount of cost. So the marketing dollars behind it are equivalent. The sort of newsworthiness and the amount of media attention, of course, is much larger. But to me, the interesting question is the timing. Why are they pushing this so quickly? Especially when almost weekly new evidence seems to surface suggesting that John Paul was at least aware of some of what was going on in the church, if not involved with concealing it. Which is a little controversial to talk about. Yes, ma'am. She's asked what I'm working on next, and I'm interested in, and I've talked with Random House, my publisher, about this idea. I don't know if this is going to come to fruition, but I'm fascinated with the government's intervention in our lives in terms of what we're told to eat or not eat. And the arrests of parents, this is kind of a new dynamic, the arrests of parents who are charged with neglect based on the diets of their children. And I'm looking at a story in Greenville, South Carolina, of a woman who's facing 2 felony charges because her son is very large. And so I'm interested in exploring just the encroachment, I guess, of government in these criminal matters. And is it a criminal case, how much you feed your kid? So it sort of branches away from the faith aspect. I will say there are a number of great individual stories in this book that I could write books about. And very briefly, not to ramble on too much, but there's one, I will actually cover 2 non-medical miracles. The medical miracles are far more common to land on the desks of the Vatican investigators, but one story about a submarine that went down off the coast of Peru. And in the briefest version, the captain of the ship, in some moment of panic, remembered a story his mother had told him as a little boy about a nun who had come over from Europe and was a missionary, and for some reason his mind flashed on her. And as the ship is sinking, as the sub is sinking toward the bottom, he flashes back on the story his mother told him, and somehow, basically the water is flooding through the forward compartment of the submarine. He's got his men in the back of the boat where there's a last air pocket, and somehow he musters the strength to close this hatch. The US government actually came in and investigated that, said it was physically impossible for any one person to close that door with the amount of pressure that the water brought. And I was just telling my brother on the way over here tonight, the irony of that story, to me anyway, was that at the canonization ceremony, that particular captain, obviously rescued eventually from that boat, handed Pope John Paul II a small replica of the submarine, which later went on to be used in military missions and killed hundreds of people. And so here you have a celebration of a miraculous moment and a prayerful moment, and the payoff is he's handing over a war machine to the Pope, all in the same place and in the same conversation. And I just found that story. This topic is just filled with stories like that. I could have written 5 books based on those. But anyway, that's hopefully my next idea. She's asking about the rates of canonization and how that's changed. And prior to John Paul II's change of the rules, having the number of miracles required, in the 500 years preceding his papacy, the number of canonizations was roughly in the 300s. During his reign, John Paul II sainted 482 people. Pope Benedict has slowed that rate down to some degree, but he also waived, as I said, the waiting period for John Paul II, so he continues to kind of crank out the numbers. And under John Paul, the Vatican acquired kind of a catty nickname by the journalists in Rome. They began calling it the Saint Factory, because it was just a conveyor belt, and every weekend there was a new saint, it seemed like. So it was a stark increase and a stark change in the number. And the criticism being, to the earlier point of a fairly unknown nun from France. I quote someone in the book who's a critic of that change, saying, I'm sure these are all very interesting people, good people, but are they really worthy of sainthood? I mean, that's what the watering down process does. It creates these questions about the value of who our saints are during our lifetime, who the people who are being sainted. Well, it's a very highly guarded number, and I will tell you the approximate cost, the quick answer is about $1 million. And partly that's because often these cases stretch over decades and decades and decades, but one of the very interesting parts of researching this book was I sought to have the Sisters of Providence basically tell me how much it had cost their order. They were the ones funding the cause for their founder, and it turned out to be a really sensitive, touchy question, and it got into a little bit of back and forth sort of journalist versus nun, tug of war in terms of the facts, and ultimately they just refused to tell me. One of the real coups that I lucked into while reporting this was I found an ex-nun who was partnering with the nun who was spearheading the cause that I write about. She had left the order, but she had since become a high school principal, and she was very business savvy and very organized, and the two really made a great team. One was the good soldier, the nun, and one was just hardcore, sort of, I'll get this done. But the ex-nun told me, she said, I remember seeing so many checks that the nun, the sister, was writing for $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. And she said, this is the kind of woman who walks into a store and will not buy a dress if it's over $27. And she said, here she is just writing these checks without it blinking. And so it amounted up to a really high number. And that cause, as I said, spanned 100 years almost. So the Archdiocese of Indianapolis basically said, you can count on it being about $1 million process. He's asking about St. Christopher not being a saint, not being a real person. I actually cover that in the book, and that came into play in the early 60s, I believe it was. There's a saint called Saint Philomena, who, it's a wonderful story where she was martyred. She was killed because she refused to basically become the bride of an aristocrat at the time, and I believe it was the 2nd century. And this very grand story was sort of built around the fact that she retained her virginity and was dragged into the street and killed because of it. And then they found her body 2 centuries later with a vial of her blood, sort of sitting on her chest. And they looked at these tiles in the burial tomb, and they translated the tiles to Philomena. Somehow they put it together. Well, this was all the Vatican. Well, in the meantime, this entire sort of cult builds around this story and around her, and there are St. Philomena churches and schools all over the world. There's a huge cathedral in her name in Europe. And in, I believe it was the 60s, it says in the book, the Vatican stepped in and decided to look at this again, because there were a lot of people saying, not so sure about this. I don't really remember. We can't find any evidence that this woman existed. They ultimately looked at it and decided it was a fable. And they retroactively took away her feast day, which is what saints are sort of receive as part of the celebration of their life, and basically just said, there is no saint by that name. That's all a fable. And so they touted that as as evidence of how airtight their work is and how serious and intellectual and just how seriously they take these cases. So I assume the same process with St. Christopher. I haven't heard from the Vatican yet. I don't know that I will. I mean, there are, many books written about what the Vatican does, and I will say that this doesn't really, and he's asking if the Vatican had any opinion. One of my favorite moments in researching this book was sort of the naive notion that I could just call the Vatican and say, so what's up with this saint naming deal, Can you lay it out for me? And there is no particular person you can call. You have to really work the people. So I found the highest ranking American in the saint naming wing of the Vatican and continuously tried to reach him by telephone. It was 10 times I think I called him because of the time difference. I finally get him at like 3:15 in the morning where I am. And he finally, talks to me and says, okay, you can come on over and I will speak to you for 20 minutes. So I go to Rome and I go to Vatican City and I sit down with him and he said, now why are you here again? And basically I explained what I'm doing and he said, well, I can't really talk to you. I need the Cardinal's permission for me to even have a conversation with you. And I'm thinking, well, there's $10,000 I'll never get back again. But I sort of convinced him that maybe we could just have a casual conversation and I will promise to try to get approval later on to use this. And sure enough, I did. I had to write this form letter to the Cardinal, or very, very, very stilted letter to the Cardinal, and he did agree. And the interview was dynamite. He did prove to be everything I needed in explaining not only the theology of the process, but some of the philosophy behind why, in this day and age, miracles and saints are still important. But I haven't heard that Monsignor Robert Sarno is his name, and I haven't heard from Monsignor Sarno yet. In fact, I just today finally received an email from somebody in Rome who I work very closely with on the book, and this is the man, if you haven't read it yet, Dr. Andrea Ambrosi is his name, and his assistant, he has one American assistant, and she said he loved it, and he felt like I captured his work in him and Dr. Ambrosi perfectly, so it's always a relief to hear, believe me. Well, you guys, thanks so much for coming out again, braving this horrendous night, and Joe, I appreciate you having me in, and hopefully this was a worthy conversation for the Center for the Book. It's an honor to be here, honestly.